tell a lot of people, you have to, don't depend on anyone. Do it yourself, just believe in yourself and keep working at it. I couldn't afford to go to film school. I learned from the library. I learned how to type, I learned how to read a script, I learned how to do all that from the library. People say, why you didn't go to school? I was taking care of my kids, I couldn't afford it, couldn't find a job. So I learned from the library.
Okay, let me see how yours turned out. Oh, it worked, look. Okay, let's add some stuff in there. So what are you gonna write in yours?
How's it going, Ravi? You like the book?
Yeah.
Awesome. When you're done with that book, we gotta do an activity, okay? This is every day I give you the paper.
Tell me about your experience before this film using libraries. Did you use a library as a child? Do you use libraries researching films?
Really, I used the library in Boston and Brookline as a child, and I of course used the university libraries when I went to college and law school. But since then, which was quite a long time ago, I didn't use libraries very much because when I wanted a book, I bought it. And I didn't have any research papers to do, thank God. So it occurred to me a couple of years ago that a library might make an interesting subject and be consistent with the other films that I've been doing in this so-called institutional series. So I called up the president of the New York Public Library, Anthony Marks, and asked him if I could come see him, and I went to see him, and he said, okay.
And was it always, this project was it always about the New York Public Library system in general, or were you originally interested in the Schwartzman building?
No, I didn't know enough about what was going on in the branches. I simply said I wanted to make about the New York Public Library, and then when I came down and visited this building, and then a few days after that, they took me on a tour of some of the branches, and then I obviously wanted to include some of the branches, and I think the film actually takes place in the Schwartzman building as well as 13 other buildings.
And how did you end up selecting those branches? It seems like a daunting geographic scope in a way.
Well, yeah, because it's all over 3 boroughs. Fortunately, the library publishes a monthly and weekly bulletins about what's going on in the various branches, so I could look at those and figure out what activities, I was interested in, and I knew I wanted to do something in the Library of Performing Arts, and when I heard about the Library of the Blind, I knew I wanted to go there, and then, for instance, I read that there was a job fair at the Bronx Library, so I thought that would be interesting because I didn't know before I got permission the range and scope of the activities of the New York Public Library, which and how the various branches are also learning centers and cultural centers, and the wide variety of activities that take place in the courses that are offered. There are hundreds of courses that are offered in languages and in business practices, in history, in English literature, and American literature. So the library is not only an important cultural institution, but it's a really good example of what a major democratic institution can be, because it's open and accessible and available to everyone, and not just in theory but in practice.
And is that a conclusion you reached through the making of the film? Or
yeah, well, I didn't know enough about it before I made it, but certainly a conclusion. I think that's one of the film's, one of the ideas that the film illustrates.
And how did you go about selecting, as you said, these various activities, classes, performances spread across the boroughs? Or something?
Well, by trying to inform myself of what was going on and then making a choice. I mean, each day, or sometimes in advance, when it was necessary to tell the people we were coming. So I in part worked on a day-to-day basis, and in part worked in advance. So I knew where I was, at least occasionally knew where I was going to be in a particular day. And sometimes I just hung out, went somewhere and hung out. But for example, I learned early on the days that Tony Marks was having senior staff meetings, so I just sort of regularly attended the senior staff meetings. So we would say, I've forgotten the day, but let's say Wednesday. I knew that Wednesday morning at 9:10 there was a senior staff meeting where it would last about an hour, and the heads of the various 5 or 6 people the heads of the various departments would be there.
So, for example, in the film, I noticed one of the most striking sort of currents through it are many discussions of America's race relations through history.
Yeah.
Was the selection of those, obviously you selected those events to attend, but then in parsing your footage, is that like a theme you brought out of things you found?
Yeah, I mean, among many possible themes, that's the theme I selected. One of the themes I selected to emphasize in the film, because I'm not the first to discover that race relations are important in American life.
No, but it's unusual that such a large and venerable, and one could think maybe stodgy institution seems to be proactive in addressing.
The thing is,
history,
it's not stodgy.
Yeah.
I mean, one might have that impression if you hadn't spent time here, but it's far from stodgy. It may give this venerable old building may give that impression, but when you go out into the branches, they're very tuned into the life of the community. And the Schoenberg Center, Library for Black History and Culture, is very active. And the one of the 2 guys that talked about slavery in Senegal had been a fellow at the Cullman Center, which gives grants every year to 15 writers to be in residence. And I think he was talking about his research, or one of them was talking about his research, and the other one was talking about a recent book. And so, by chance, I mean, it wasn't by design, by chance, I came across a number of interesting references to contemporary relations in the history of slavery. So when I was editing the film, it seemed to me very relevant to use those.
Absolutely.
But it wasn't, I didn't know in advance that I was going to come across those. I mean, that was a consequence of studying the rushes and evaluating what I had.
And so that was one direction that you decided to take the footage.
Yeah, that's one of several different themes in the film.
And at what point, is it mostly in the editing process, or is it also in the shooting process where you feel like you sort of found the, keystone or sort of central structure of the film?
I don't have any idea during the shooting what the structure is going to be. And I really don't have any idea what the structure is going to be till I'm well advanced in the editing. Usually the structure emerges in the last couple of months of the editing, because I can't edit it in the abstract. I have to see what the consequences and implications are of the sequences as I've edited them and as I've placed them.
So as you're shooting something, if you happen across a sequence or a moment that you find particularly strong and suggestive, you don't necessarily alter what you're going to be shooting in the future to sort of build out that thing?
No. I mean, I like to think when I get a good sequence, like the sequence in McComb's Library, which is a little branch up in Harlem, I know right away that that's a good sequence. But oftentimes, I'm wrong in the sense that it's 3 months later or 6 months later in the editing room in the cold light of dawn, something that I was very enthusiastic about doesn't seem to hold up. And conversely, something that I might have dismissed as not being very interesting may become very interesting as a consequence of other choices that I've made. But the structure of the film really emerges in the last 6 or 8 weeks of editing, after I've edited all the sequences that I think I might use into close to final form. And it's only then that I begin to think more seriously about the implications of the choice and how to place them.
So this film, it seems like, was shot in 2015, late 2015?
Yeah, it was shot from September to the beginning of December in 2015.
But imagine, based on when you're releasing it now, that you were editing it possibly during the election last year?
Well, actually, Yeah, I mean, I finished the editing, I think, on November 10th, and I did the mix the beginning of December.
Would you say the political climate of the time changed?
Well, no,
the way you were
I don't think the
approaching this?
political climate affected the editing, but I think the film benefits by the idiocies that are going on in Washington, because the activities of the New York Public Library and the point of view of the New York Public Library toward education, toward immigration, to immigrants, toward poor people, is completely the opposite of what the Trump administration represents. So I think there's such an enormous contrast between the library and the fact that the programs of the library show an interest and a concern and a wish to help and represent the best aspects of democracy, whereas the Trump administration represents the possible onset of authoritarian or even fascistic government. So that the contrast between the programs of the library and the programs of the Trump and the ideology of the Trump administration couldn't be more extreme or more different.
And in the film, I was struck by the architect who's in charge of redoing this building, stating that she doesn't see libraries as storage places for books, but as something like a gathering place for people to increase in knowledge.
Right.
And one of the things I was sort of also struck by your film was that it could easily have been about maybe the materials in the collection or about the architecture of the buildings, which...
Well, I mean, there are a variety of ways. Sure, there were a variety of ways it could have gone.
Yeah. But it really is about the staff outreach.
But, you know, I mean, what was of interest to me were the programs, and I mean, in a more abstract way, it's a movie about New York, because you see in one form or another all social classes. You see from the richest people in New York, some of whom are on the board, to some of the poorest people in New York, and you see aspects of immigrant life. You see people with no jobs, or people wanting to improve their economic position. You see people of all races and ethnicities. So it's, you know, in a sense, like it's another melting pot movie, a bit like Jackson Heights, although a different subject.
Yeah, but it's also a movie that in a way responds to Jackson Heights, because it's about the outreach that touches that community, and also about the history of how that community came to be. I was really struck by the scene of the guy studying Jewish delicatessens and the history of Jewish eating and gathering places in the city, and how that culture came together and then dispersed, much the way that Jackson Heights is about cultures coming together.
Well, yeah, I mean, Jackson Heights, in one sense, is not exactly the same, but has similarities to the Lower East Side at the beginning of the 19th century.
Yeah, it's true. I wanted to ask you sort of more general, formal question, or maybe aesthetic question, which is that in many of your films, this one included, you're shooting things that, I don't know, many people would ostensibly consider visually uninteresting subjects, like boardroom meetings or public talks. And how do you approach framing and creating visual interest in scenes that one might simplify as about dialogue or discursive content?
Well, I mean, you know, some of my films are more dependent. I mean, some films are dependent on talk, and some films are more obviously visually interesting. I mean, Zoo, there isn't that much talk because the animals aren't that articulate. I mean, so some of the movies are told more with the story is told more with the pictures than with words. I mean, a movie, Ex Libris, is dependent on words. But I mean, you try to make the picture, try to make it visually interesting by who's photographed and the way they're photographed, and also by the rhythm of the cutting. And so, you know, I work hard on all of that.
Some tied to that in rhythmically cutting and who's looking and what you're looking at. I was thinking a lot of the crowd reaction shots or personal reaction shots during speaking sequences in the film, and I assume those are clearly sort of artificially constructed and that those people are in the same room at the same time it's happening, but that's obviously not a reaction they're having to the moment that you're playing.
No, that's not. No,
And
because
so,
you only have one camera.
right, of course.
So
So how are you approaching that sort of reconstruction of a response, or are you looking for people who are giving interesting responses or responses that you want to elicit from the line spoken? I mean, it's this amazing sort of
No,
very simple...
I try not to distort the material to make a point that I want to make that's not there. But I do hope that I recognize the points that are being... I mean, part of my job as editor is to think that I understand what's going on, so that I can reduce a meeting that in real time was an hour and in film time is 7 minutes, and that 7 minutes may be edited from all over the lot of the hour, but has to appear as if it took place the way you're seeing it in the film. So it's fictional. I mean, it's not completely fictional because it's not staged and it's not written, but it's fictional in its relation to the time of the original and the fact that it's made up of shots and of dialogue that took place over the course of an hour and are compressed to 7 minutes. And the cutaways are never, or almost never, I mean, occasionally they're the cutaways that may be related to what someone's saying if we're not on the person that's talking. But most of the cutaways are just cutaways that are collected in moments, what I think are duller moments during the meeting, and they're collected because I know that I won't be able to reduce the sequence to a usable form unless I have the cutaways. And I always try to use shots that I think are appropriate. They're usually shots of just people listening. They're rarely commentaries on what's said. There may be somebody with his hand like I have my hand now, or maybe somebody scratching their head or changing the position of their body. But, you know, I won't, to take an extreme example, I won't use a shot of somebody yawning to emphasize the point that they're bored. Unless it was a yawn that occurred because I happened to be on the person who becomes the cutaway and not on the speaker.
Is that a challenge to sort of avoid that sense of editorialization, even though when you're obviously editorializing,
well, I don't know if it's a challenge, but you have to resist being a wise guy. The temptation is there, but you have to resist it, because if you are a wise guy, you're only making a fool of yourself. I don't try to make fun of people. It's not that I'm not interested in comedy, because I think that, and from my point of view, some of the films are very funny, but it's not comedy that I've imposed on the situation by editing. It's comedy that's inherent in the situation, what the people actually say and do.
I feel like a great example of that in the film, for me anyway, was the sequence on the 6th Avenue 10th Street Library, that beautiful old, almost like castle-looking building.
The Jefferson Market.
Jefferson Market,
yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
Where you start inside and we see some of what's that library is like, but then outside is the Halloween Day Parade,
right,
which on the one hand is a documentation of the Halloween Day Parade and that it's geographically adjacent to this library, but also almost seems like this pop culture onslaught that's happening outside the building. You see that tremendous spider almost seemingly attacking the building. And for me, that sequence really exists, sort of in this doubled existence of a documentary moment and an almost a phantasmagorical, fictional event.
Right.
Yeah.
But see, I can only use that if it hadn't happened in front of the Jefferson Market Library, and if the spider hadn't come down from the library tower, I would have had a tough time rationalizing its use.
And lastly, I was wondering if you had started the film by orienting more towards sort of the staff side of the institution than the patron side, because in a way, except for a couple of community meetings, the patrons of the library are very passive things. They're people who are listening, people who are reading, people who are absorbing information rather than people who are doing things.
But I mean, I had to make a movie out of it. And as interesting as sitting reading is, maybe, or getting stuff out of the archives, unless there's something visually, unless there's an interesting conversation or something visually, it's hard to sustain it. I mean, the archives are very important in the actual role of the library, but they're less interesting from a film point of view. I tried to suggest the archival life in the library by that scene in the reading room when somebody's doing some research on Yeats and Burroughs, but the film emphasizes more the community orientation of the library.
Is that a struggle for you sometimes, where there's an aspect of the subject that seems to be a part of the subject, but is not something conducive to what you're filming?
Well, I mean, I don't know if it's trouble, but I mean, I looked for ways of suggesting the archival aspect visually. For instance, with the great print collection and the scene toward the end of the film, because I mean, it's an extraordinary collection of prints. And also some of the photography exhibits. But the research aspect, unless someone was talking about the research, as the people do when they talk about slavery in Senegal, it's hard to, it's a limitation of the technique.
I thought maybe for a final question, maybe something a bit more speculative. In the film, the library administration always seems to be arguing amongst itself about where funding comes from and what the mission of the library is, and looking at the statistics for digitalization and statistics for internet access. It seems to be quite aware of sort of surveys or arguments for and against different kinds of librarianship. Do you know if they want to sort of view your film that is completed as a sort of analysis or an argumentation for a certain kind of
I can't speak for how their reaction to the film. I know they like the film, but I mean, how it fits in their minds, into some of those issues, I have no idea.
I guess it's more like, do they see your job here as making a portrait of the library, or you making an argument for what the library can be?
Implicitly, it's certainly the latter, but actually, it's meant to be a portrait of the library. And the place is complex and as vast as the New York Public Library. You can never touch most places. I mean, it always has to be an impressionistic, subjective account. It can never be, definitive is an overworked word. It can never be that. It's always partial. It's always selective, and no two filmmakers, or if people are doing a book, then it's never going to be the same, because I'm limited by what I find and how I figure out how to use what I find.
Great. Time. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good interview.
Really good to talk to you. It was really a beautiful.